See everybody. This is a good crowd.
Boy, yeah.
And you guys are troopers now. You get a star for coming out on a day like today.
You should charge admission to get there.
Don't give me any ideas, but anyway. So I think many of you know that I spoke in Lancaster Tuesday night. If you were at that Lancaster talk, will you raise your hand, please, so I can know, you know. Okay, and we got, so about half and half. The folks who did go to that Lancaster talk are going to hear additional information today. I'll be going over things in more detail. Before we really get started, I've had a question or two about that building over there. That building there was built in 1910, and it's part of a complex of buildings. There were 10 or 12 foundations of buildings beyond that, big things. They were all on the scale of that size. That building was made to produce fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer. And apparently at the turn of the 20th century, Germany was the place for converting the nitrogen in the air. 80% of this air we breathe is nitrogen. Converting that nitrogen in the air into a nitrogen fertilizer. And what is necessary to do that, they figured in Germany and had German engineers, and German engineers built that. Every single material in that building came from Germany. Those bricks were made in Germany and sent over here and stacked right there. The trusses inside, everything was made in Germany. So what this was a grand multi-million-dollar experiment. So to make nitrogen fertilizer from the nitrogen in the air, you have to send it through an electric charge. Well, who around here's got electricity? That dam right there from Duke Power's got electricity. So they used excess electricity from that dam, ran air through it, and made nitrous oxide. And apparently if you add water to nitrous oxide, you get nitric acid. And if you add limestone to nitric acid, you get nitrogen fertilizer. And all that nitrogen fertilizer they were making, they could sell it for $50 a ton. But it cost $90 a ton to make it. So this was a multi-million-dollar experiment in today's money. Back then, it's probably a couple of $100,000, but it was grand and the state of the art. It was a 5-year experiment, and it didn't last. They shut it down about 1915. But you know, if you ever have some time, we're not going to take the time this morning, but if you do go in that building, it is very interesting. And anyway.
Durant, was it shut down because of the Great War too, as well as the...
It was built because they thought there was world turmoil and there was going to be a famine throughout the world, and we needed nitrogen. So anyway, that's enough about making nitrogen out of the air we breathe. Today we're here at really a spot that is central to a lot of South Carolina history, central to important South Carolina history. And because it's important to South Carolina history, it's important to American history. From right here. From right here at this point, Fishing Creek, when Sumter had his camp here, and I'm going to go through these details. This spot right here was the spot of the lowest point of Patriot forces in the entire Revolutionary War. When Sumter got wiped out in this battle, that was the lowest point of South Carolina. And here it is where we're standing and seeing this. There was a battle here at Fishing Creek. We don't know where Fishing Creek came into the Catawba River. Now this is Fishing Creek right here. And just over that rise there is the Catawba River, and it goes on down, and it's a grand river. So there's a historical marker 2.5 miles up the road up there, denoting the location of the Fishing Creek battle. We do not know the actual site. We want to know it, but we don't know it. That marker was put up there based on a map that was drawn in 1870 by the grandson of the grandfather who was at this battle. And that's where, that got, so somewhere between this point, probably within a 5-mile range, is where Sumter's camp was. And when I talked Tuesday, I was talking in a chronological order about how the events were progressing. Today, we're not going to talk about things chronologically so much. We're going to be talking about things geographically, because this is where we're standing. So, geographically of where we're standing, what we're doing is standing in the area where Sumter had his camp on August the 18th of 1780. Now that date is important because on August the 16th of 1780, that's when the Battle of Camden occurred. And it was a horrible defeat. The Patriot forces were just scattered to the winds. So, this is when Cornwallis defeated Gates. Gates was coming down from the north with the 2nd Continental Army. Charleston had fallen, May the 12th, 1780. Charleston falls. Gates is coming down to relieve South Carolina, to save South Carolina. And Thomas Sumter, who was in this area operating, knows that Gates is coming down, so he goes and meets with Gates. And he knows that a battle is coming between Cornwallis and Gates. And Thomas Sumter says to Gates, it'd be a great idea if I captured the British supply train. And Sumter loved nothing more than capturing supply trains, I guarantee you. If there's any, well, there's several criticisms that could be made about Sumter. And one of them is the fact that he was extremely fond of taking goods from the enemy, which is a nice way of saying he was a plunderer. And he was. That's how he paid his men, for one. But he wanted to take the British supply train, which was at Carey's Ford on the Wateree River at this time. Carey's Ford, Carey was a Loyalist. He had a fort there guarding the fort across the Wateree River. To get from 96 to Camden, you had to go through Carey's Ford. And there were 35 Camden Loyalist militiamen at Carey's Ford, just kind of hanging out and watching what was going on. There's several themes that I want you to keep in mind as we're talking today. And one of those themes is the inability of one militiaman to tell the difference to another militiaman. There were Loyalist militiamen and there were Patriot militiamen all throughout these events that we're going to be talking about today. And one key characteristic of militiamen is you can't tell one from the next. They all look the same, they all dress the same, they all talk the same. They were neighbors with each other. So, and the Patriot militiamen, they would put a piece of white paper in their hat, and the Loyalist militiamen, they would put a sprig of greenery in their hat, and that was their uniform in many cases, such as Kings Mountain. So, Sumter wants to send, a couple of his companies down to Carey's Ford just to check things out. Now, at Carey's Ford, there were about 35 British supply wagons. See, when Cornwallis called his forces in, he abandoned Rocky Mount, he abandoned Hanging Rock. This is before the Battle of Camden. Brought those in, brought in reinforcements from 96 through Carey's Ford, so there was all kinds of supplies there. There were 300 head of cattle, a herd of sheep. So he sends Lacey and Taylor, two of his colonels, with about 30 or so men in to check out Carey's Ford, and they, check it out. They ride right into the middle of it. They ride right into the middle of all these Loyalists who think that they are Loyalists as well, and they welcome them in with open arms, and they get captured. And then Sumter behind them just marches right on in. And this is August the 15th, 1780, the day before the horrendous Battle of Camden. Now Sumter has all these goods, all this plunder, all this rum, tents and so forth, everything else. While he's there are an additional 70 men from the 71st Regiment of Foot coming from 96. The 71st Regiment of Foot is the best regiment that the British have. And they march right into Carey's Fort, and they march right into captivity with Sumter's men. So now Sumter's got 100 prisoners, 50 wagons, 300 head of cattle, and a herd of sheep. And a partridge, never. The battle occurs, and it's a terrible disaster. And there's Patriots just heading through the swamps all around through here, total chaos. They want to make it back to Charlotte, and then they want to make it back to Salisbury, but in the meantime, they're being chased down by none other than Banastre Tarleton. So Sumter finds out about the battle, and he says, oh my goodness, we got to get out of here. So he starts moving all of that material, men, prisoners, from Carey's Fort, and he starts moving them up this way, up the west side of the Catawba River. And, it is hard to get those Conestoga wagons across the creek. You got to stop what you're doing. You got to get extra men and horses to pull and pull and pull. You got to unload them and reload them, all this kind of stuff, just to cross a creek. And the roads were pitiful to begin with. And it was incredibly hot. Any description of these times talk about how hot it was. So midday of August the 18th, and this is 2 days after Camden Falls. That is when Sumter crosses Fishing Creek. And he says, okay, I've got the Catawba River there, I can use that as a defensive line. I've got the Fishing Creek here, I can use that as a defensive line. I am going to stop and rest here in the middle of Fishing Creek and the Catawba River. And he has patrols, vedettes set out watching the British forces that were coming after him. And there were two groups of British that were coming after him on the west side of the Catawba River. And this is one under Patrick Ferguson of Kings Mountain fame, and the other was George Turnbull, who was the commander at Rocky Mount. So Sumter's checking them out. He's got eyes on them. He's got time. He can take a nap here at Fishing Creek, because he had been going hard for 36 hours. So his men were here. They stacked their arms. They were swimming in the river. They were drinking rum. They were killing cattle to have a big barbecue. And while Sumter exactly knew that Ferguson and Turnbull were down there, what he did not know was that Banastre Tarleton was coming up the west side of the Catawba River. And he comes all around, and he comes and he crosses the Catawba somewhere up there. And he comes over and he stands on top of the hill, and he looks down, and there is Sumter's camp spread out before him. Sumter had 700 men in addition to his 100 prisoners and the cows and the sheep and all that. So Sumter looks at it, and Tarleton looks at it, and he sees the arms are stacked. The men are swimming in the river there. He hears an occasional shot from where they're killing the cows. So his vedettes, his front guard comes up and run into the vedettes, and the vedettes fire warning shots. And Sumter, he was asleep. He said, "What was that?" And I said, "Oh, they're killing cows." I said, "Okay." So he goes back to sleep under a wagon. He's in his underclothes, if that much. His uniform is off. And when Tarleton sees that, he has 170 men. But he immediately charges as his trademark, his claim to fame. He comes through there with 170 of his cavalry of the British Legion, and they're hacking and chopping and slashing as they go. This right here was the worst defeat. That Camden was bad, this was worse. This was the worst defeat that Patriot forces had in South Carolina during the Revolutionary War. It came at the darkest time that we had. When Camden had fell, that was an absolute tragedy. Now Sumter was the only organized opposition in the state of South Carolina, and he is obliterated. He hears the noise and the crash of the attack occurring. He sticks his head out from underneath that wagon. He sees what's happening. He takes a knife and he goes to a horse that was drawing a wagon, and he cuts it loose, and he jumps on that horse with no bridle and no saddle, holding on to the hair of the horse, and he's riding down through, trying to get away as fast as he can, and he's looking behind him, and he's going, and he turns around and wow, he gets hit right in the face with a oak limb, knocked off his horse unconscious, and one of his men find him there and take him to safety. But that's how close Sumter was to getting captured here. There was another incident at Fish Dam Ford where they sent an assassination team after Sumter. He got away, but I'll tell that story a different time. So this is so important in South Carolina history right here, because from this point, this was not the only battle that occurred on August the 18th, 1780. There was another battle that occurred about 40 miles up the road up here. And this is on the Enoree River, where Lawrence, Spartanburg, and Union County intersect. And it's a place called Musgrove Mill. So while there was activity here in the backcountry, serious opposition was arising in June and July. There was numerous Patriot victories. Huck's defeat was a major victory before Camden. In Spartanburg County, there were 5 battles in 4 days that pushed British lines back 40 miles. We don't talk about that a lot because there's 5 little bitty battles, but when you add them all up, it's a pretty big deal when you push the enemy lines back 40 miles. So a lot of that activity in Spartanburg County was generated from Charles McDowell's camp, which is on the North and South Carolina border. Charles McDowell was a North Carolinian from currently Morganton, Quaker Meadows area, and he had about 300 men with him. And there were South Carolinians joining with him, there were Georgians joining with him, and because of the activity in victories, there was a certain fellow on the other side of the mountains who was interested in what was going on around here. So Isaac Shelby came over with 60 or 80 men from over mountain Tennessee area. And there were 3 colonels in McDowell's camp, and that was James Williams with the Little River Regiment, which is currently Lawrence County. For 10 years it was Little River Regiment. And there was Elijah Clark from Georgia and Isaac Shelby from the Over Mountain men. And they're in McDowell's camp on the North and South Carolina border. And they get word that there's 200 Loyalists at an outpost at Musgrove Mill. And they figure they're better guys than those Loyalists were at Musgrove Mill. And they left at dusk and traveled all night long 40 miles down to attack that Loyalist outpost at Musgrove Mill. Well, when they got there first in the morning, they found out that that outpost had been reinforced overnight with 300 men under the command of Alexander Ennis. These were provincials, and they were on their way to 96. But now the 200 backcountry men and over mountain men are facing 500 Loyalists at Musgrove Mill. What are they going to do? Get on their horses and turn around and ride back? Because their horses are worn out after going 40 miles. So they quickly form a breastworks on top of an old Indian agricultural field. And they send one of their men, Captain Shadrach Inman, down to charge towards the Tories, which are down there along the Inaree River, and to try to egg those Tories on into an ambush, chasing him and following him. Oldest trick in the book. And he finally aggravates those Tories so much that they can't stand it anymore, that they just charge across the river, full speed ahead, helter-skelter, going after Shadrach Inman. And that field, you know, was broken and hilly and so forth, and it was really hard for them to maintain cohesion as they were coming forward. But as they were coming forward, all of a sudden they saw where those 200 men were lined up behind the breastworks. And they looked at them, and they were 110 yards away. And they stopped, they lined up, they got in order, and they fired volleys from 110 yards away. Well, those muskets they were using, they're accurate to about 80 yards, but they're not accurate from 110, and they continued to charge up the hill. And the Patriots behind the breastworks, they were armed with rifles primarily, but some had muskets. And as the Loyalists charged on from about 50 yards away, then they opened fire. They blasted, and that was a devastating effect. And the attacking Loyalists were stunned. Everybody's reloading and everything. Alexander Ennis comes on scene, and he gets his men organized, and he starts to make progress on his left flank. But as he's doing that, he gets shot in the neck and unhorsed, and then again the Loyalist forces lose all cohesion, and they the Patriots just charge after them, and they just flee, and they're running downhill, and there's continuing mayhem and slaughter as the Tories retreat, and it was an overwhelming victory. On August the 18th, 1780, this day right here, where it was so horrible, there was a victory at Musgrove Mill 40 miles away. It was a glimmer of hope. A glimmer of hope. And I'll tell you this. We talk about turning points in the war. Saratoga was a turning point. And let's know that Saratoga is the turning point. But when you're looking at the war in the Southern Campaign, which is the most important campaign, when you look at that and you think, well, Kings Mountain's a turning point. And Cowpens, that's a turning point. But neither Kings Mountain nor Cowpens would have ever happened if it hadn't have been for Musgrove Mill. There was not a single significant loss for the Patriot cause after Musgrove Mill. Now, Greene, the brilliant tactician that he was, he technically lost 4 major battles. But he strategically knocked the crap out of them on those battles. They had to retreat. The British forces had to retreat after every significant battle they had with Nathaniel Greene, even though the British kept the field. So this is what I'm saying. There was not a single significant defeat after Musgrove Mill. Musgrove Mill was the turning point. So that's what happened here, which is the last item chronologically of what we're going to be talking about today. Today we're going to be talking about a few other situations that occurred here, and then we're going to Hanging Rock, and we'll talk about the 2 battles that occurred there, and then we'll go to the Waxhaws and talk about the situation that occurred there at the Waxhaws. Then we're going to have lunch at a Mexican restaurant, and then for those of y'all who want to go, we're going to go to Waxhaws Presbyterian Church, and we'll look at the tomb of William Richards and Davy at that point. So I said Waxhaws, and this is some of the first events to occur around here. Excuse me. Waxhaws occurred on May 29th, 1780. This is about 2.5 weeks after Charleston Falls. For 2.5 weeks after Charleston Falls, South Carolina is absolutely under British domination. Quickly, they set up major forts in Georgetown, Camden, 96, and Augusta. And from these forts, they had satellite forts. The purpose of these forts was to sign up Loyalists, reinforce the Loyalists, and plunder the Patriots. Because the Loyalists had been plundered for the past 5 years, now it was a Loyalist turn. That's exactly the way it was and exactly the way it happened. But Patriot resistance in any sort of organized form did not occur until the 6th of June in 1780. The 6th of June, and where that initial resistance, that initial pushback started was about 5 or 6 miles up this way. And that's at Alexander's Old Fields, Beckhamville, very close to this area. Within a week after what happened at the Battle of the Waxhaws, Buford's massacre, the word is out, passions are inflamed, and that is when John McClure and 32 other men shot up the Loyalist gathering that was at Alexander's Old Fields. Now, you know, it was kind of gathering, you have to come in. You have to come in and sign your loyalty oath, and if you do, you'll be left alone. But if you don't, you're going to be plundered. Anyway, there were about 200 Loyalists up there at Alexander's Old Field, and they shot them up. Now, there's no casualties reported, and there may not have been any, and it may have just been a warning. I don't know. But 4 days later, there was another situation similar to that at Mobley's meeting house, and that was where the Loyalists were keeping their plunder, and that plunder was returned to their owners with the events that happened there. So one thing I want to talk about in particular here at this particular location is one of the forts that the British had on this side of the Catawba, which was guarding the ford, and that's at Rocky Mount. The British had two primary outposts here, forts here, based out of Camden. That was Hanging Rock, which we're going to see, and then Rocky Mountain, and these were sister forts with each other. Rocky Mount was on the other side of Rocky Creek from here. It was an eminence. It was a house, a big house on a hill overlooking the river and the ford. The house was a 2-story frame house, a frame house. That's pretty fancy around here. We didn't have frame houses in the 96th district. And beside this big 2-story frame house, there was 2 outbuildings. Could have been something like a smokehouse or a kitchen or something like that, heavy log construction. And one of the reasons it's called Rocky Mount is because they were big boulders placed, you know, throughout the entire area, covering this open hill that was clear cut for 200 yards all the way around. That's the range of a rifle shot. And the British had fortified this place. And one of the fortifications they used was abattis, 50 yards out, all the way around the frame house. Abattis, that's sharp saplings that are laid, you know, pointing outwards all the way through, and then you take a machete or something, you whack off the tips and you sharpen the tips, and so you've got pointed limbs pointing all around you if you try to charge through that abattis, and it's 18th century barbed wire. And Sumter came down and he attacked Rocky Mount on August the 1st of 1780 because he knew that Rocky Mount was behind the plundering, the burning of the Hills Iron Works, you know, the burning of Reverend Simpson's house, the burning of Fishing Creek Presbyterian Church. All of that came out of Rocky Mount through Christian Huck. And Sumter knew that. Sumter wasn't around during that particular period because he was up in Hillsborough talking to the governor and getting 17,000 pounds worth of money to supply his army with, which he was doing. But he's got 500 men now, and he's attacking Rocky Mount, which is commanded by George Turnbull and 150 men of the New York Volunteers and 150 men of the Camden Loyalist militia, 300 men. And 3 times Sumter attacks that abattis and he cannot get through it. And you know, you try that, and when the guy next to you gets shot, you say, this is not working, so it's time to rethink. So they retreated and that sort of thing. So Sumter's looking over the battlefield, and he, you know, there's big boulders on this battlefield, and there is some big boulders pretty close to one of those outbuildings, which is close to the frame house. And he wonders if a man could get set up behind that boulder, could he then throw flaming ingots onto the house? And he turns around and he looks and he asks for volunteers who'd be interested in doing that. And the thing of it is, while there were a bunch of boulders all the way around, there was a 100-yard gap from that one boulder, the shelter rock, from the next. And he asked for volunteers to make that run and throw flaming brands onto the house. And one man stood up. And this is Colonel William Hill. Colonel William Hill, the owner of Hill's Iron Works. William Hill was a hero. And what he did here at Rocky Mount was one of the most heroic actions of the war. Problems with him in later life, but for now, he's a hero. So, William Hill did not have to volunteer. He could have told his men, you two right there, y'all are volunteering. You go make that 100-yard dash. But you know, he stood up. And he asked for another volunteer, and Sergeant Jimmy Johnson said he would do it. So this is the only time that I know of in the Revolutionary War. These men strapped body armor to themselves, which was out of fat lighter. Y'all know what that is. So they wrapped cords of fat lighter around their bodies, and they ran that 100 yards up to that shelter rock, being shot at the whole time. Bullets were going through their clothes. They were knocking off locks of their hair. They made it to the shelter rock, and they started to make their firebrands. When they look up, and Turnbull has sent a bayonet charge out of the house, coming straight at them. They weren't armed. So now they're facing a bayonet charge coming at them from out of the house. So they have no other option. They run back down that 100 yards they just crossed before. And they were being shot at the whole time. And they get back there, and Sumter's like, God, I didn't think of a bayonet charge. We're going to set up our riflemen here so that if they come out with the bayonets again, our riflemen will be able to pick them off. What do you think? Y'all do it again. So they put the body armor back on, and they crossed that 100 yards again, shot at the whole way. And then they got behind the shelter rock. And behind the shelter rock, they built a fire, and they started taking that fat lighter and, you know, throwing it over. And they did that, and caught one of those buildings on fire that was beside the big frame house. And that thing started roaring fire. And it was getting so hot that this frame house, the smoke on the wood frame house, it started to smoke. The sides of the house started to smoke. And boy, they knew they were just moments away from burning those British out. When, lo and behold, what we got here today, a major thunderstorm came up right at that moment. And it came up and it doused the fire. And you were defeated. You couldn't do anything. And you couldn't fight anymore because you couldn't load the wet powder in your weapon. So Sumter had to retreat. And Sumter did retreat. And this was the first action that Sumter had as a militia general. You know, it was a defeat for him. So he starts to retreat, and he's retreating. He gets 500 or 600 miles away, and he gets to the banks of Rocky Creek. And that thunderstorm had released such a huge amount of water that Rocky Creek was flooded, and he couldn't get across Rocky Creek. Now his plan was to meet with William Richardson Davie on the way back to Charlotte. He had sent William Richardson Davie on a diversionary attack to Hanging Rock, and we're going to talk about that later on. But he couldn't get across to meet with Davie because for 2 days he was stuck there, and he was only 6 miles away from Rocky Mount. But Turnbull and his men did not go after Sumter. But who did go after Sumter was a unit from Hanging Rock, the Prince of Wales American Regiment. One account says there were 175 men, another one I read said there were 500 men. I'm not sure how many men there were, but these were American provincial soldiers led by Major John Carden, who was a British regular, and he was leading these American provincials from New York, Pennsylvania, and areas like that. And they were stationed at Rocky Mount. And when they hear about, they were stationed at Hanging Rock. And when they heard about what happened at Rocky Mount, they cross the Catawba and they come out and they start to come after Sumter, who was not far away. Sends 2 men down to check out where Carden and the Prince of Wales Regiment is. And those 2 men get captured. And John Carden strips those men naked and hangs them on the side of the road as spies. And he comes on this way. So I'll tell you a little bit about John Carden, what kind of a fella he is, and what kind of character he has. But John Carden, and I believe this may have happened after the Revolutionary War, but John Carden was married 3 times. He never got a divorce. His second wife died at the age of 21, and 6 weeks later he married his 3rd wife. But at about that time, apparently his first wife was starting to put some kind of legal pressure on him for the divorce proceedings to proceed. But John Carden felt like it would be easier for him to fake his own death rather than go through a divorce from that wife number 1. But that's one of the things that he did after the war. And I'll tell you what he did at Hanging Rock a little bit later on. But Sumter does mount Richard Wynn and his regiment of 100 men as a rear guard there at Rocky Creek, and Wynn and his men were able to hold off the Prince of Wales Regiment as Sumter and his men were able to continue their retreat. And they join up with William Richardson Davie there at on the road to Charlotte. So at this point, the narrative picks back up at Hanging Creek, and we will be, going through there, and I'll be giving some instructions as far as that's concerned. But does anybody have any questions at this point?